everyone, and welcome to our latest edition of ITI Insights. We are looking forward to bringing you today's virtual briefing on the new long-awaited national cyber strategy that was released yesterday. As the Global Trade Association of Tech, ITI has consistently advocated for a unified U.S. cybersecurity strategy that promotes U.S. leadership in technology, innovation, and national security. The 5 pillars of the strategy that came out yesterday include detailed and action-oriented goals and demonstrate how the Biden administration will equip a new U.S. cybersecurity workforce to maintain our nation's security. The strategy also lays out how the administration will work with the private sector to defend critical infrastructure, support economic security, and address software vulnerabilities. The strategy highlights the need for federal investment in the U.S. government's own cybersecurity and emphasizes the importance of global engagement and collaboration. ITI looks forward to continuing to work with the Biden administration and the Office of the National Cyber Director as they begin to implement this strategy. Today, I'm excited to introduce 3 of the industry's foremost cyber experts, ITI's John Miller, Gordon Bitko, and Courtney Lang. Together, they will dive into the strategy, share their analysis, and describe what comes next as we look to implementation. We hope those of you joining us today on Zoom will participate in the conversation. We'll be taking your questions later in the hour, so please add them to the chat using Zoom's Q&A or chat function. And with that, I'm pleased to introduce John, Courtney, and Gordon, and we'll turn it over to them to kick off the conversation. Thanks so much.
Wonderful. Thank you for the introduction, Ashley, and really happy to be here today to talk about the National Cyber Strategy. As many of you on the call are well aware, yesterday was a big day. We've been waiting on the strategy for some time. First strategy since 2018, and so certainly a big deal, not only for us as industry, but also writ large, the administration. And so happy to be here with both John and Gordon today to talk a little bit more about what's in the strategy and what it means for the tech industry. So I think maybe as a brief level set, I'll just talk about kind of the 5 pillars that the strategy is organized around, and then we'll get right into conversation on the strategy itself. So as I mentioned, the strategy is organized around 5 pillars. The first one being defend critical infrastructure. The second one being disrupt and dismantle threat actors. The third being shape market forces to drive security and resilience. The fourth being invest in a resilient future. And the fifth being forging international partnerships to pursue shared goals. At the final part of the strategy, there is also a section focused on implementation, which talks about the plan that the ONCD will develop that will task the interagency with various lines of effort to carry out the strategy, and then talks a little bit more about next steps. So with that, I'm going to jump into conversation with my 2 colleagues here about the National Cyber Strategy. And I think maybe a good place to start is actually, John, I'll start with you first. Wondering if you can share a little bit about your initial impressions of the National Cyber Strategy and key takeaways that are particularly relevant to highlight for folks.
Thanks, Courtney, and welcome everyone. Looks like we've got a big group, so excited to have this conversation. Yeah, I mean, I'll hit a few top line points, and we can, I'm sure, dive into more detail on some of them as we go along here over the hour. I mean, I think first of all, it's notable that it's a fairly comprehensive and wide-ranging strategy in terms of coverage, and also the federal government's role, which is kind of, prominent throughout. I suppose that shouldn't be surprising, given this is the first strategy that's been created under the auspices of an Office of the National Cyber Director. But I do think it's notable. I think one of the big themes, though, despite that significant federal government role, is that there is a significant theme of collaboration and partnership throughout the strategy. I think there's a recognition the federal government can't do many of these things or perhaps any of them alone. So there's a lot of different, portions of the strategy that talk about collaboration with industry, collaboration with international partners, state and local and tribal governments, and of course, Congress for some of the, legislative aspirations that are teed up. I would also say that the strategy is more, for the by and large, it's evolutionary rather than revolutionary, and I think that's a good thing. I mean, it builds on the work of prior administrations and past strategies and executive orders, from the Trump administration and also, certainly the Obama administration. Obviously there are some new features as well, which I'm sure we'll get to. I think it's notable that the international pillar, which is pillar 5, it's really, I think it's strong. There's a lot of conversation there about leveraging specific partnerships and mechanisms that have been recently established by this administration, including or during this administration, such as the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and also mechanisms of recent vintage, like the US-EU Trade and Technology Council, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. Also pleased to see references to the importance of international standards as the basis for new technical requirements in a few different places. I know we'll get more to this. Maybe I buried the lead that there's certainly a regulatory element to this strategy. I think it's fair to say that at least as it's drawn up, there's a fairly thoughtful approach to how regulation would be tackled. Maybe a little more of a heavy-handed approach in the shifting liability area, and I'm sure, as I say, we'll get more into that. And then finally, maybe the most important and hardest part of the strategy is found on, I think the last page when it talks about the implementation plan. As I said earlier, it's evolutionary. So a lot of these ideas are not necessarily new, and we've seen them before in various different policy documents over the years. I think this strategy really takes a more coherent and comprehensive look at maybe how some of these things fit together. But the big question is really going to be, can we and the federal government and can all of us collectively follow through on the many, many different lines of effort that are teed up here? And that's something that we can't answer today, but certainly look forward to talking about some of that and the work that lies ahead. So I'll stop there. I don't want to steal all of the all of the top line takeaways. I'm sure Gordon has a few extras as well.
Great. Thanks, John. Yeah, Gordon, why don't you share with us some of your key takeaways, particularly from a federal government perspective and what that means?
Thanks, Courtney, and thanks, John, and thanks for everybody who's here joining us today. The first thing I do want to do is recognize the work of ONCD in actually getting this across the finish line. We all know the challenges in the interagency process, and we all know the number of stakeholders who are particularly invested in cyber. So clearly the strategy took a long time because of that, but the fact that they did get it across the line is hopefully a step in the right direction. There are, as Courtney noted, a few public sector, federal government specific things where I think the strategy is a little bit more than just an evolution from the 2018 strategy. The first is there is a really clear exposition of the importance of the federal government investing in its own IT and modernizing its own defenses and dealing with legacy systems that are insecure inherently. That goes significantly beyond the 2018 strategy and its indication of the importance of that and the need for the federal government to be more effective and successful itself. The second thing that I think is really important, though, from a federal public sector standpoint, and this comes not only in the strategy, but if you had the opportunity to listen yesterday, and Neuberger made repeated references to the federal government using its purchasing power, using its ability to influence the market, using its ability to drive change through its own procurements, but also the money that goes out through the Infrastructure Investment Act, the cybersecurity grant program, and so on. And that's a place where I think the regulatory aspect of this goes somewhat further than we would have anticipated previously. So not only is the strategy talking about regulating things like software development for federal contractors, but I think you can look through many of the other sections of the bill, of the strategy, sorry, which are not directly about federal procurement, but make reference to things that the federal government is going to expect out of its contractors. So for example, in the point about improving the fundamentals of the internet, excuse me, there is a lot of talk there about technology investments in things like IPv6 and encrypted DNS. Those aren't things that are required of contractors today, but if I were doing business with the federal government, I would be thinking about and preparing for those things. So that's a second point that I think is important. And then the third thing, just to reiterate what John said, is the resource requirements. It's not only the dollars to do these things, but the people to do all these things, all of these regulations, all of this harmonization that's talked about, all of these activities, they take a lot of expertise. And the concern I've got is there just are not that many people within the government who have that expertise. And so I worry, and hopefully we'll talk about this more here today, John, and certainly going forward, I worry that we're in for a long haul to see any of this stuff actually implemented in a useful way.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both for those initial insights. I did want to say thank you to those of you that are putting your questions in the chat. We'll make note of them and respond to them as we go along. Try to insert some into the conversation. If we don't get to them, we'll try to get to them at the end, but continue to put them in the chat if you have them. So John, I wanted to pull on a thread that you had raised with regard to one of the key takeaways. And I think that's something that both of you mentioned was this kind of shift towards a regulatory approach with regard to cybersecurity. And this is something that I think is important to talk about, particularly because I think it's, you know, an evolution of some of the things that we've seen. Certainly we've had some legislation passed over the last year related to mandatory incident reporting, et cetera, but this seems to imply perhaps a step further. So I wanted to ask both of you, you know, what does this kind of emphasis on regulation potentially mean for the technology industry? And how should we be thinking about cybersecurity baseline requirements moving forward? And maybe to tack on to that, you know, from your experience, are there lessons learned from past regulatory efforts related to cybersecurity that, you know, might be helpful for the U.S. government and the private sector to consider or be aware of moving forward? And anyone can jump in.
Okay, yeah, sure. I mean, I'll start with I'll start. You know, look, again, if you go right to objective 1.1, I think, I mean, it's clear that the strategy is contemplating new regulations. You know, that said, it is, I think it's hard to judge at this early stage whether this push for more regulations will be effective or will even be determined necessary, you know, until a substantial amount of work is completed on these various regulatory lines of effort that the strategy tees up, right? I mean, you know, I think I alluded to the approach here being thoughtful, and what I mean by that is, you know, if we then actually go a level deeper and look at what's in the strategy calls on the administration, for instance, to identify whether there are gaps in existing authorities to implement minimum cybersecurity requirements across critical infrastructure sectors, right? I mean, let's remember that there are critical infrastructure sectors that are heavily regulated as it is in the cyber area. You know, it's not as if we're living in a regulation-free environment here, nor are the you know, many critical infrastructure companies. You know, it also, the strategy, it says that the administration is going to work with industry regulators and Congress to close any of these gaps. You know, I think that's a good thing off the bat. You know, it does also say that regulations will define minimum expected cybersecurity practices and outcomes. I mean, this is the baseline, I think, that you were just referring to. Here it is difficult to judge kind of what the outcome of the gap analysis, if you will, is going to be. But it's really even more difficult to judge what the potential minimum cyber requirements are going to be at this point, right? Until we actually do some of this foundational work, particularly to determine, what are the outcomes, right? That these regulations, these proposed regulations, considered regulations are trying to get to. I do also think that some of the other elements of the regulatory sections, right, that are positive here. The strategy acknowledges a need to streamline and harmonize both existing regulations, as well as with any new regulations. This is something ITI and many in industry have long called for in the cyber arena. It's equally positive. The strategy acknowledges that new regulations are not without cost and encourages regulatory agencies to consult with regulated entities to better understand how these proposed regulations may, impact resources and those sorts of decisions. And then finally, there were a couple of references to, new regulations, being grounded in international standards, which the strategy acknowledges can create efficiencies by minimizing the costs of complying with multiple misaligned or conflicting regulations. So those are some initial thoughts from me. I'm sure Gordon has some others.
Thanks, John. I think that was a really good overview of a lot of the challenges with some of the regulatory approach that is highlighted here. And that's one of the observations that I think I neglected to make up front, Courtney, but is important. And that is, there isn't any fundamental change in the fact that there are still a lot of stakeholders involved, and all the different sector risk management agencies, plus all of the investigative and intelligence community agencies, and everybody else still has a role in this strategy in cyber. And that's a thing I think we all need to understand. And it ties in, Courtney, to your question about lessons learned. There have been prior attempts, any number of them that we can all point to around regulation, which haven't been effective at pulling in all the different stakeholders, either within government or across government and or between government and industry in ways that have led to effective regulation. I think people have done that. I'll give them the benefit of the doubt out of the desire to move quickly, thinking that they had good ideas about how to proceed. And what they ultimately end up learning is that there are lots of other stakeholders with important views that need to be considered as well. And the government is better off not just talking to the regulated entities up front about what's the cost of this regulation, but actually working with those entities, federal contractors or critical industries. What are the objectives that we're aiming for? And how do we build regulation that is actually going to get to that? And what are the things that we should expect out of industry? What are the things we should expect out of government in order to be effective? That's something that I'd like to see much more of in the implementation plan. The other part of your question, Courtney, from a regulatory standpoint and the baseline for cybersecurity, I think that there are hints throughout the document about that is going to continue to increase. And again, Ann Neuberger, I think, was pretty explicit in her expectations in the discussion yesterday that those things are going to appear in requirements for federal contractors and in state and local level, and are going to cascade out, hopefully, from their perspective into the market more broadly. So an example, there is a specific reference in the strategy to memory safe programming. It's a relatively new thing that the administration is focusing on that, but they've now put out guidance from the National Security Agency talking about that. And it would not be at all surprising if that becomes a baseline cybersecurity requirement certainly for federal contractors. And I think, as I noted, cascading out to a bunch of other stakeholders in the near future. And again, you can look through and find any number of other places where that is mentioned, where something like that is mentioned or referenced, and a reasonable interpretation is that's going to become a baseline requirement.
So, Courtney, could I maybe just go back really quickly to your question about lessons learned, which I don't think I answered?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you mentioned the most recent, certainly kind of broad U.S. cyber regulatory effort, or maybe not, maybe broad's not the right word, but certainly U.S. cybersecurity effort in the incident notification, arena, and that's the, CERCIA incident notification legislation, which there's an ongoing rulemaking that CISA is engaged in, and I mean, I think thus far, the jury's out, obviously, because that rulemaking is in train right now. But it's been, I think, a positive experience in engaging with CISA on that front. I think you have to go back in the U.S. I mean, arguably, you need to go back, a decade or more before, to a time when there was real significant kind of horizontal cybersecurity legislation that was proposed, things like Lieberman-Collins and whatnot. But I think for lessons learned, it might even make more sense to look at some of the ongoing regulatory efforts in the cyber arena outside the U.S. I know you know well that ITI, in particular, we're doing a lot of work in Europe right now. We saw the Network and Information Security 2 regulation finalized recently, and the big regulatory vehicle that we're focused on right now is the CRA, the Cyber Resilience Act. And one of the key issues we're trying to navigate there right now, it involves scope, and so preliminarily a lesson learned for U.S. policymakers, is to work with industry to crisply define, an outcome-based scope for any new proposals that end up flowing from this strategy.
Great, thank you. And since you just raised, what's happening around the world, John, I think maybe one of the areas that I want to ask about, and then I'm going to pivot to a couple of the questions that we've received in the chat as well, but is this component and an emphasis on international collaboration. As we mentioned, there's an entire pillar focused on partnering with our allies to advance cybersecurity objectives. And so I wondered if you and Gordon, if you have thoughts, could share a little bit about why this is important, why it matters, and particularly in the context perhaps of supply chain security, which is a sub-objective that's outlined in the strategy, why that matters and how we should be thinking about that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we all know that cyber threats are global, right? Even though the strategy is appropriately focused on the U.S. national security and cybersecurity, U.S. critical infrastructure protection, ultimately we have a collective responsibility to strengthen cybersecurity, across what is a vast interconnected global digital infrastructure. So ITI has long advocated that the U.S. government should increase its international collaboration on cybersecurity, and so we're really pleased to see the strategy leaning in on that, topic. Including to really, as I mentioned at the outset, leverage some of these mechanisms like the Quad and the TTC to try to get things done, or at least tee them up. I mean, I think also from a global company standpoint, and ITI represents companies that are doing business and engaging in cyber policy all around the globe. It's a global regulatory environment. So to the extent that some of this international activity with partners is going to help drive alignment of any potential future regulations to help avoid fragmentation, of a global regulatory landscape, I think that's really positive. On supply chain specifically, which, as you mentioned, is kind of nested under this section. I mean, I think to be fair, overall, this treatment of supply chain and the strategy is, I would say, is maybe a bit underwhelming. And the reason that I say that, I mean, it's really positive that there are references to working with partners and allies to address ICT supply chain risk management, including through those mechanisms. It's fairly lacking in detail. It's a fairly short section. I mean, I do think it's fair to say that the strategy seems to be maybe over-indexing a bit on kind of country of origin of ICT parts, rather than, the hundreds of other global supply chain threats that are related to suppliers, and that, for instance, the ICT Supply Chain Risk Management Task Force has chronicled in some of its work. Also would love to have seen a reference to the need to streamline and harmonize regulations in the supply chain risk management area in the strategy, as there is with respect to, the cyber regulations, because that is something, there is a reference to, for instance, the May 2019 executive order on securing the ICTS supply chain, and a related EO, but there are literally dozens of other active supply chain related efforts that, are not really acknowledged in the strategy. And it would really be great if ONCD takes a closer look at this area, and does what it can to also help drive some harmonization there. And I know there's a lot of supply chain dimensions in the federal procurement public sector arena too. So I don't know if you have things to add on that in particular, Gordon.
Yeah, John, I think a really illustrative example is DoD with CMMC, which a program I'm sure many folks on the call are familiar with. It's been the ongoing effort for 4+ years now for DoD to ensure the cybersecurity of the defense industrial base of its supply chain. And it highlights a couple of things. One is, of course, in DoD's initial attempt, they started with the NIST standard 800-171 for controlled unclassified information, but then they modified it for their own purposes. And right up front, that highlights why international collaboration, why harmonization of standards is so important. Because a lot of the confusion with the early adoption of CMMC was, what is DoD doing that's different? What's wrong with the NIST standard? What should we be actually complying with in order to achieve cybersecurity in our supply chain? And they wasted, I would say, in hindsight, several years trying to modify 800-171 for DoD's own purposes. I think what we really need to focus on then is in the collaboration arena, both domestically and globally, not doing that, holding the government accountable to participating in those standards processes. And if there's something wrong with a NIST standard or with any other standard, work in the standards process in the global standards community to address that. That benefits everybody from a cybersecurity standpoint. The other piece of it that from a supply chain standpoint is not touched on, but I think aligns very well, John, with the point you were just making, is all of the other efforts that are ongoing that are these sort of scattershot approaches to name and shame particular entities or particular products in ways that are not risk focused. And it would have been great to see the strategy really, again, at least highlight the need to harmonize all of those policies as well. I think that that's something, again, where the government has been struggling. We can look at Section 889 of the NDAA from 2019. It's 4+ years now that we're waiting for final rules on that. It highlights the challenge when there is this scattershot approach and the importance of hopefully the strategy driving effective outcomes that are aligned to real risk management.
Great, thank you both. I think, yeah, definitely one area that I think would be helpful to address moving forward. I want to also turn to some of the questions that we've received in the chat. I think one of the other kind of overarching themes that we have seen come out of this strategy is this idea of shifting responsibility, particularly from, the end users or the vendors to manufacturers, software developers. And one of the things that is particularly evident in this strategy is this idea of shifting liability, particularly with regard to software. And so we've gotten several questions around kind of perspectives on this proposal to create legislation to shift liability, and what that might mean. Certainly, what our perspectives are on it. And so with the caveat that we've, only had one day to kind of digest this, and certainly haven't had the opportunity to perhaps engage with a robust set of members, wanted to at least see if you guys could provide perhaps some initial takeaways around this idea of shifting responsibility and what things, might need to be considered moving forward.
Do you want me to start? Yeah, I mean, so I'm glad you provided the disclaimer that we actually haven't had a chance to talk with any of our members about this yet. So keep that in mind, everyone. But I mean, look, I mean, if I'm looking, if I put on my lawyer hat and look at this proposal, the strategy says that the administration is going to work with Congress to establish liability for software products and services, and then in the next sentence it says it's going to prevent manufacturers and software publishers from disclaiming liability by contract. I mean, just going by what's in the strategy here, I mean, I do think I have questions regarding any proposal that starts interfering with at least the ability of what appears to be from the proposal some private parties to enter into contracts. The strategy talks about shifting the responsibility to stakeholders that are most capable of taking action to prevent bad outcomes, which it seems to indicate are those parties with, quote unquote, market power. The underlying premise here seems to be that the bigger companies are somehow, this is my reading of it, that bigger companies are somehow cutting corners and not using appropriate software assurance practices. I mean, I would ask a question whether there's data that supports that view, because I don't know that in my experience that is the case. I also have a lot of questions about how this type of approach would be implemented. How are we, for instance, how would the approach define market power, right? Are we talking about revenue? Like, what's the cutoff? I mean, I think whenever you start kind of distorting market incentives and contractual relationships, you could end up getting kind of the opposite result than you were hoping for, right? The result, let's just pick a number. $1 billion, $5 billion, it doesn't matter. But whatever's above, if you're above the line, it's going to likely make software produced by those companies, of course, more costly. And below the line, you're going to have, cheaper software that might contain more vulnerabilities. So I don't know exactly how to do that in a way that addresses the goals. Now, I do think that maybe the mention of a safe harbor here, that for companies that are adopting best practices, perhaps those are the practices in the SSDF. I don't know. Maybe that will mitigate some of the concerns, but I really think the implementation details on a proposal like this are really critical, and it's hard for me to judge exactly where things might shake out. But I do think that it's also equally critical to have conversations amongst government, and industry, and of course, particularly the software community on this set of issues.
Thanks, John. Gordon, did you have any perspectives you wanted to add to that?
Thanks, Courtney. Just a couple of quick follow-ons. Obviously, John has far more expertise in this area than I do, but the point about how do you assign this responsibility and what constitutes who are the actual big entities who have the resources, I think in practical terms is really difficult to implement. And it creates this dichotomy of, if you're somebody below the line, you don't have to comply with good software practices. Whereas if you're somebody above the line, you do. Of course, the reality in the world is, and certainly looking at it from the public sector space, it isn't such a cut and dry divide. You might have a very small business somewhere in the supply chain for DoD or anybody else who's relying on a managed service provider or a cloud provider or somebody else to deliver something as a service. That's a significant chunk of what they do. But at the same time, that small business is still responsible for ensuring the background checks of the people who are coming into their office and who are accessing their systems, and that they have the right controls in place. So you can't really create this bifurcation and say it's one or the other. I think that's a real challenge that the safe harbor provisions are going to struggle to figure out exactly how they work. I think related to that, we see, though, that the government has said it's going to use the False Claims Act. It's telling people, if you don't comply, at least in the federal contractor space, we are reserving the right to start to come after you. And trying to use something of the stick approach there. They haven't done that yet, to the best of my knowledge, but they've put people on notice, and so I anticipate that, at least in the federal contracting space, there will be some version of the, if you have not complied with the SSDF, if you have not met the minimum standards, that they are going to start to try to name and shame people. So I do expect that that's going to happen in some form, at least in the federal contracting space.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate the perspectives. Again, I think this is something that we're going to need to think more about moving forward. But I think, lots of folks are interested in our perspectives on this proposal and what it might mean. So I think, at least an initial sense is helpful. And we'll look forward to continuing to work with folks as this proceeds. Maybe another question from the chat that I think might be interesting to talk about is the disrupt and dismantle threat actors section. That section, has a lot of detail on kind of employing tools to disrupt adversaries. And one of the questions that came in was around whether this is a more aggressive offensive approach than what's been taken in the past, or kind of how offensive kind of cyber interactions or activities are taking place or envisioned to take place in this strategy.
You want to go first this time, Gordon?
Sure, John. I'll jump in. I think it's a great question. I don't actually think that there's anything in that section of the strategy that is going above and beyond what the administration's been doing for a while. I think what it is doing is putting down in writing. And if you go back to the intro, naming countries where they think that it's particularly appropriate. So it's maybe going a little bit further in the actual documentation and the actual writing of what's being done. I don't think it's any different in the sense of there have already been executive orders. There's already been authorities established for offensive activity, and I think it's pretty clear that the government has been using those in one way or another for a while. So I think it's at best just the clarification in writing of what the strategy has been in this space.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Gordon's perspective here. I mean, just as an example, there is a lot of talk of disruption of adversaries, including even in the international section, for instance. But there's not necessarily, I don't think there's a difference in kind here, but maybe in degree, right? I mean, the examples they give of disruption are things that have been going, that the U.S. government has been working with, industry and others on for a long time, like botnet takedowns, for instance. I mean, it does seem like there's a desire expressed to maybe increase and scale these activities but I don't know that I wouldn't say it's more aggressive, but just more of doing more of what is already going on in this area. There's discussion also of like the DoD's defending forward approach, as Gordon mentioned. That stuff is not new, but I mean, look, I guess from an industry standpoint, it's always good to see a focus on the malicious actors themselves, right? And so I think it's positive, but not terribly new, I guess.
Yeah, definitely not a sea change. But one thing I did want to follow on, John, that there is an explicit call for additional resources for the NCI JTF, which has had the authority to do these things, but for the strategy to single them out as the entity that should take the lead in these sort of, at least the botnet disruptions and things like that, I think is a little bit of a tweak. And then, of course, the need for resources to be more effective, as with many other areas of the strategy. And as we've discussed, it's great to put that down on paper, but implementing that, which agencies that participate in that JTF are going to contribute those resources, how many, how are they going to be allocated? I think all those implementation questions will be really key when it comes to this particular disruption question.
Got it. Well, thank you both for those responses. Shifting gears a little bit, we also received a question around kind of an analogy that Ann Neuberger used yesterday at the event around restaurant cleanliness and the need to kind of convey to consumers trust scores related to their app and or IoT devices. And the question is kind of around what ITI's position is on providing consumers with more visibility into their apps or IoT devices with a trust score or trust label, as it were, as recommended, and wondered if you could share a little bit about that. Certainly in the strategy, we see kind of a continued emphasis on labeling as a means to advance consumer trust in products. So would be interested to hear any perspectives that you might have on that front.
Yeah, I mean, I can certainly start on that. Yeah, I mean, certainly in the strategy, as you point out, this is kind of in the IoT section, right? And it says that the administration is going to continue, to advance the development of the IoT security labeling program, which, was teed up by the Biden administration's executive order. From the standpoint of ITI, I mean, we probably a couple of years ago at this point, published, security labeling guidelines. So I think we're, supportive conceptually of that. I think on the trust score dimension of that, I think I guess I don't know that our principles address that per se, but I think the key is that any label is, communicating useful information for consumers, right? I mean, for instance, is the label representing that the device you are buying can be, upgraded and patched or, to close security vulnerabilities or something like that. I mean, that's important information. I think in terms of we need to know what the trust score represents exactly before we can judge the trust score, I think, concept that Ann Neuberger was discussing yesterday.
Fair enough.
Yeah, and she gave it in the context of a restaurant analogy, which is a nice, easy to understand, digestible, pun intended analogy. But it also reflects the reality that that's a relatively static thing, right? You can go look at a restaurant, your Department of Health Services or whoever it is that does that in New York can go in and determine that is a clean restaurant or not and put a label on. And that is a relatively static thing. Like I said, we all know that software is different. The environment that you use it in matters. Whether you do things like John said about maintaining it yourself and patching it and having good passwords and all the other things that are not necessarily about that product all matter. So thinking about a trust score or something like that as an analogy to a restaurant cleanliness score, I think is a top line nice analogy, but when you really dive into it, I'm not sure that there's a one-to-one relationship. And it's really, again, the details would really matter. And we run the risk again of if people think something like that's a silver bullet. This is an application or a device that gets an A. You don't therefore have to worry about the security for it. And then that's the opposite of the message that we really want people to take away. It might mean that they've got good development processes. It might mean that it is, as John noted, patchable and maintainable. That doesn't take away from you, the end user, the responsibility to do those things. And so I think we just need to be careful with how we think about implementing anything like that and thinking it's a silver bullet.
Yeah, that's a really important point, Gordon. And I've had many conversations with policymakers over the years who want, thinking about these things like, can we have a security star type label and we just stick it on and say this is secure? As you point out, it doesn't quite work that way. So that's why, the last thing I want to do is create a false sense of security that you're done and that you don't need to continue to be vigilant with your product. And that's why a label that communicates, for instance, if something is, upgradable is more meaningful potentially.
Great. Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think at the core, you know, providing information to consumers is important to facilitating trust, but it is about, again, kind of what the details look like and what sorts of things you're communicating and how that's done in conjunction with kind of a broader approach to raise awareness around what the actual label means, et cetera. So I think there's, you know, a couple of things that have to be done in conjunction with the actual, you know, labeling effort itself. I think we're running up on time, so maybe one more or two more questions to kind of lead us to the end of our session here. Wanted to ask, and we talked a little bit about this at the beginning, and you guys both kind of referenced implementation as being something that's really going to be key here, right? So we have the national cyber strategy out now. There are, you know, a lot of aspirational objectives in here, but there's also then going to be this implementation plan that's developed. And so wanted to see if you guys could share perspectives on what areas, you know, might need to be prioritized in the implementation plan, and also kind of your views on how the private sector should be engaged in the implementation of these various objectives moving forward. Gordon, do you want to start, or John?
Sure, John's taken the majority of these questions first, so it's only fair.
All right.
A few things certainly focused from the public sector standpoint, but I think that apply more broadly. Number one is there just needs to be some clarity from the administration when they say the implementation plan is coming soon. You know, what does that mean? They're kind of freezing the field a little bit, and people are, I'm afraid, going to sit around and wait for the implementation plan before they do anything. And that's, I think, the last thing that anybody actually really wants to have happen. The continuous message from everywhere is don't wait, do the best you can to improve your cybersecurity while these plans, while these strategies, while these regulations are being developed. I think from my standpoint, in terms of what's going to be most effective, it's in the implementation plan, what's most important, it's the harmonization piece of it. It's the figuring out what are all the different regulations, both in the federal space, in the public sector space at the state and local level, across critical industries, and figuring out how to streamline all that. Otherwise, we all know, unfortunately, regulation is a one-way ratchet most of the time. We don't take things away, we add things, and that makes the environment more complicated, and that's not the goal. So for me, number one is ownership of what that is going to look like. Number two, and this is a parochial interest for sure from the public sector side, there is, again, good language about the public sector, about the federal government modernizing its own defenses, improving its legacy systems. The government has for years struggled to come up with a real strategy about how to do that effectively, with a real priority list of what are those critical assets that do need to be modernized. How should we go about modernizing them? What's going to be involved from a resource standpoint? So I think that from a public sector parochial standpoint is the next most important thing. And then I think the third thing from a public sector standpoint is there's already a swath of regulations that we're waiting for. And let's either tell people how those are going to fit in with the strategy. The SSDF is a great example of that. The requirements from 14028 about incident reporting for federal contractors, about common cybersecurity language in contracts, we're still waiting for those things. Do those align still with the strategy going forward? There needs to be, in the early days of the implementation plan, sort of an overall master. What are all the pieces? How are they fitting together? When are they coming? I think that those three things from the public sector standpoint are necessary to be successful. They're not sufficient, but they're necessary.
Yeah, I think Gordon's spot on kind of the harmonization point, right? I mean, you know, the implementation section of the strategy makes it clear that ONCD is going to coordinate implementation of the strategy. So, you know, even though it's going to be real, you know, we know an implementation plan is coming from the strategy, and all those, it's going to set forth all these, you know, multiple federal lines of effort that are necessary for implementation. It's really the coordination by ONCD, and I think figuring out how those pieces fit together that is arguably the value add, because again, we haven't had an ONCD there to drive implementation in a coordinated way necessarily of previous cyber strategies. So I mean, I think at the top line, that's probably the most important thing. I mean, in terms of which, I mean, I think a fair case could be made that everything in here is important, right? I mean, so it's hard to say, we should prioritize this or that. And I would assume that the implementation plan is going to set forth lines of effort to do it all, right? I mean, again, it's a world of limited resources, so we likely can't do anything. I mean, everything, but I do think it's important when that implementation plan is published that those federal lines of effort not only have owners, as Gordon said, but that they have a robust role for the private sector in many of them, if not all of them, but also that they have some measurable outcomes and deadlines associated with them. I think a good precedent maybe to look to is this administration's executive order on cybersecurity. I think 14028, which had 30 some odd lines of effort, all with pretty precise timelines associated with them. Not all those timelines have necessarily been adhered to, but the strategy implementation plan should at least try to do that, I think. And then I guess, I do want to mention one other thing that we haven't talked about really quickly that I think is important across the board, and maybe some folks missed it. But if you look at, I think it's section 3.1 that talks about, the holding the stewards of our data accountable. There's essentially an endorsement and support. I read it as an endorsement and support for comprehensive federal privacy legislation there. And I think that's been a priority for a long time for ITI and many. So would love to see that line of effort accelerated, honestly. Thanks.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both. I think we've kind of gotten to the end of the programming here today. Unless either of you have kind of final thoughts you'd like to share about the national cyber strategy, anything we didn't cover that would be helpful to cover. Welcome, any last thoughts you might have. Two things really quickly, maybe just to mention that we didn't get to, I know Gordon talked a bit about resources earlier, particularly in the context of, federal procurement. I think another interesting part of the strategy was that in a few different places, it talks about tying investments in cybersecurity into, as kind of an integral part of a modern industrial and innovation strategy, and referencing significant legislative efforts that have passed recently, such as the CHIPS and Science Act, the bipartisan infrastructure law, the IRA. I think I think generally our members are pleased to see cybersecurity as a dimension of those programs, and so that is a way to to also kind of tie together some of these various different investments that the government has committed to over the last couple of years. And then the other thing I wanted to say is I know we had a lot of questions come in during the chat. I mean, we can certainly try to answer some offline if we didn't get to them, so apologies if we didn't get to all of them. Yeah, thanks, John, and thanks for participating today. Gordon, did you have any final thoughts you wanted to share? Anything that we didn't get to raise that you think would be important to highlight?
Just a couple of quick closing thoughts, Courtney. And the strategy is 40 pages. There are undoubtedly things that are in there that we didn't cover today that people will circle back on later and say, hey, this is a really important point. And I expect we'll all be working on that and digesting it. And as I noted already, waiting for the implementation plan with bated breath. I think the most important point out of all of that, and it comes back to, as John was just noting, the resource question, and the government's not going to be able to do this by itself. It doesn't have the depth of people and skills across all the agencies, all the stakeholders who are involved to do all this in a vacuum and in a reasonably timely fashion. It's critically important that the government that the administration works with industry, works with stakeholders outside of the government in order to be effective. There is just no other way to tackle all of these problems. And so that's, I think, an important point that I really want to emphasize. Number one. Number two, ITI and its members are fully committed to the importance of cybersecurity. And like John noted, I think it's a great step in the right direction that the strategy has noted in so many places the link and the importance of cybersecurity. That's something that I think we all collectively need to live up to and to hold each other accountable to, and not have it be just lip service, but have it actually be something as we look at additional regulations, as we look at additional investments, as we look at additional appropriations, ensuring that cybersecurity is really accounted for as a baseline. That's, I think, a signal from the strategy of the intent of the administration, but actually doing that when every individual agency is also fighting for its budget for a million other priorities that it's got, it's easy to get lost in the noise. It's really important that we all hold everybody accountable to the importance of cybersecurity to be able to have any hope of doing all the things that are called out for in the strategy.
Yeah, totally fair. And I think that's a good note to close on. I think, actually funding the different activities is going to be really important, and having the resources to carry out all of these different lines of effort is something that's going to be paramount moving forward. So with that, I think we're going to wrap up. Thank you, everybody who joined us today. Really appreciate your time. We'll be posting a recording of this webinar on ITI's YouTube channel, so please look out for that. And then if you have kind of follow-up questions, particularly if you are with the press and you would like to speak with any of us about our thoughts on the national cyber strategy, you can reach out to Janae Washington, and we will put her, you can find her on our website, but we'll also put a link to her email in the chat box. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. And we will look forward to staying in touch as this moves forward.